Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Guilfoyle, the president of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. I'd like to welcome you to CRC's webinar, Reform of Michigan's Ballot Question Process. This webinar is being presented by the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. CRC is a statewide, nonpartisan public affairs research group. We promote sound public policy for state and local governments through accurate, independent, and objective research. We are a private, not-for-profit entity, and we rely on the charitable contributions of foundations, businesses, and corporations. I'd like to encourage all of you to join our circle of supporters and help us continue to provide high-quality, independent information on important policy topics in Michigan. Please note we are recording this webinar, and if the technology works, we will be posting it up to our webpage where it will be available for further viewing. Second, we have everyone but the presenters on mute, so we will not be able to hear you if you speak. To ask a question, please type the question into the questions pane that should be appearing on your screen. You can type these questions in at any time. If you have any technical problems during the webinar, please let us know by calling 734-542-8001. After the webinar is over, you will receive an email soliciting your feedback, and we'd very much appreciate any feedback you have. Today's webinar on the ballot reform process is going to be presented by Eric Lufer, CRC's Director of Local Affairs. And with that, I'm going to turn the webinar over to Eric.
All right. Evidently, I was talking, but no one was hearing. So let me start over. CRC took on this issue after the November 2012 election. And you'll recall back that issue, we had 6 ballot questions, 5 of them constitutional amendments, and 1 referendum. There was some unease at that time, and some editorials were written saying maybe Michigan should look at the way we do things, see if there isn't a better way of doing it. So CRC took on the issue, but in doing so, it wasn't quite clear exactly what the problem was. What are the issues that really need to be identified? Was it the number of ballot questions? The fact we had 6 on the ballot, did that suggest that maybe it's too easy to qualify questions for the ballot in Michigan? Was it the fact that this is what we identify as direct democracy, a tool for the people to have a say in government when the elected officials don't seem to be listening? That would suggest sort of a grassroots effort, but then we have this cottage industry that's developed wherein individuals are paid to solicit petition signatures that would kind of seem to run counter to that ideal. Is it the content of the questions? We've had ballot questions throughout our history, going back to the '63 Constitution that we operate under currently. But when you look at those, the early questions, and those in the 1960s and 70s, were really about sorting out the new Constitution, settling some matters that didn't seem to fit right with the new body, the powers and structures of government. And then we got into the 70s and 80s into the early 90s, and a lot of the questions were about tax revolt and setting limits on the taxing power of government. So those all seemed to fit, and people maybe didn't have as much unease with those questions. But then we get into recent years, and we have a lot of what would seem to be social agenda issues: prohibition on same-sex marriage, prohibition on affirmative action programs, authorization of stem cell research, authorization for medical marijuana, limitations on the use of expansion of gambling. So maybe it's the type of questions that are being asked that was creating some of this unease. Maybe it's rooted in the process. We have a role for the state of board, the Board of State Canvassers, but that doesn't seem to work well. We have questions reach that point, and then there's deadlocks and races to the courts and other problems that arise. Or maybe the problem appears after that, where things qualify for the ballot, but then we get electronic and printed advertising that doesn't seem to quite tell the whole story about what's going to work and how it works, and if how the people will be affected by the changes that are being proposed. As I get into this, I want to make clear this was something that was very evident as I started the research, and I want to make it clear as I lay out some of the issues and talk about some potential reforms, that the First Amendment is very much a part of everything we talk about here, the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. It says, "The Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances." So what the people have done as we talk about these tools of direct democracy is they've reserved the right to themselves to make laws. They've reserved the legislative power. And that involves the type of interactive communication concerning political change that is appropriately described as core political speech. And the courts throughout our history have held that sort of core political speech to a higher level than just the normal speech. We all have the freedom of speech, but they've given special protections to that core political speech. The challenge in the efforts to reform Michigan's ballot question process is to focus specifically on the issues determined not to be working as well as we would hope, and to craft policy solutions that do not diminish the First Amendment rights of those interested in proposing or opposing the ballot questions. Well, what are we talking about here? Let's just define the playing field a little bit. We have statutory initiatives that are permitted in Michigan. Article 2, Section 9 of the Michigan Constitution, the people have reserved to themselves for the purpose of laws to enact and reject laws. Any law that the legislature may be enacted through a referendum or initiative process, invoked by filing petitions containing signatures of registered electors equal in number to at least 8% of the total votes cast in the last election for governor. Those petitions are presented to the legislature, and the legislature is required to enact without modification or reject any proposed initiative within 40 session days. An initiative not enacted by the legislature is placed on the statewide ballot at the next general election. A law that is initiated or adopted by the people is not subject to gubernatorial veto, and one adopted by the electors cannot subsequently be amended or repealed except by the electors or by a 3/4 vote of the legislature. We also have the ability to propose constitutional amendments through the ballot questions. Some of those appear through legislative action that requires 2/3 votes of each legislature to propose a question, and then that appears on the ballot and requires approval of the people. Or the people have the right to circulate petitions, and file those petitions containing signatures of registered electors equal in number to at least 10% of the total votes cast for governor in the last election. We have voter referendum provided for by Article 2, Section 9 of the 1963 Constitution, the power to approve and reject laws enacted by the legislature. Referendum must be invoked within 90 days of final adjournment of the legislative session during which the law in question was enacted by filing petitions containing signatures of registered electors equal in number to at least 5% of the total votes cast for governor in the last general election. Once those petitions are filed, the law in question is suspended until the electors approve or reject it at the next general election. We have legislative referendum provided for in Article 4, Section 34, that any bill passed by the legislature and approved by the governor, except the bill appropriating money, may provide that it will not become law unless approved by the majority of the electors voting thereon. We also have constitutional revisions that's provided for in Article 12, Section 3 of the Constitution, and that the Constitution provides that it will appear automatically every 16 years after in 1978 and every 16 years thereafter, and as such times as provided by law. The difference between a constitutional amendment and a constitutional revision would be that the constitutional revision is a process where the people can draft a whole new document or rewrite the existing state constitution. So first of all, was 2012 an unusual number? We had 6 ballot questions, little more than we have had in recent years, but when we went back and looked, there were years where we had more. In fact, we have had ballot questions on the ballot in every one of our even number years. We call those general elections, the election where we're voting either for governor or for president. We've had at least one question every year since 1964, except for in 1990. And we've had some ballot questions presented at May, June, and August elections in even number years, and a few special elections in 1981, 1989, 1993, those being odd number years. The 6 ballot questions was a fair amount in recent history, but we go back in 1978, we had 11 questions. In 1968 and 72, 8 questions apiece. You see in 1980, 1982, we had a fair number, and then 6 questions appeared on the ballot in 94, 96, 2002. So while there might have been some discontent with the ballot, the number of ballot questions that appeared, our history shows that we've had more years and times with equal number of questions. Those appearing on the ballot, we've had 114 ballot questions under our history of the 1963 questions. 2/3 of those ballot questions have been proposed by have been constitutional amendments, either because of legislative action, that's been about 40%, or by an initiatory petition, about 27%. We've had proposed statutory changes introduced by citizen initiative, which have constituted about 11% of the total, and almost 1/5 of the questions were referendum on legislative actions. We looked at the approval rate and found that the approval rate was not incredibly high. We've had about 44, almost 45% of the questions have been approved by the people, and that varies by type of question, with the legislative initiated referendum enjoying the highest rate of success and the voter referendum having the lowest rate of success. So given that the actions by the legislature have constituted a high number of the questions we've been voting on, we started off by looking at how legislatively initiated constitutional amendments get on the ballot and how does that compare to other states. What you see here is a map that we've created that shows the other states relative to Michigan. We've used Michigan as par and measured each state relative to Michigan. Those states in the dark red seem to have a process that is more harder, the rules more restrictive for putting questions on the ballot. The pink would be those that are a little bit more restrictive. The gray states are about equal to Michigan. Light green would suggest that it's fairly a little bit easier for the legislative bodies to take action, and the dark green would suggest it's much easier. We did this by looking at the type of vote that's needed. In Michigan, you need a 2/3 vote. Some states require only a simple majority, 50% plus one vote. Some require higher majorities. Some states require action in multiple legislative sessions. Michigan only requires one legislative session. So we broke that down. What we see is that there are 15 states that are about equal to Michigan. Another 15 states are those that are in pink and red that would suggest that it's a little more difficult in those states to propose a constitutional amendment. And that leaves about 10 states, that leaves 19 states that have a less restrictive process for putting questions on the ballot. When we looked at the type of majorities required, we see that Michigan's not unusual, Michigan being in the yellow here, not unusual in requiring a 2/3 vote. The 50% majority is a fair number, and then there's a small number that's kind of the beige there that requires a 60% majority, and the state of Connecticut requires a 75% majority if they want to get something right to the ballot. There's different process if they vote on it over 2 legislative sessions, but if they want to take it right to the ballot, it requires a 75% vote in each body. We see that there are 15 states that require action in 2 legislative sessions, Michigan not being one of those, but some of our surrounding states, Wisconsin, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and New York to our east, require action in 2 legislative sessions. So just to recap what we found here, about 40% of the ballot questions that have been submitted to the electors under the 1963 Constitution have been legislatively proposed. Michigan requires the legislative chambers to adopt with 2/3 vote of the members in joint resolutions to place the ballots on the question. This is a higher majority than is required in more than half the states. However, the fact that several of the other states require legislative action more than one session to protect against sort of knee-jerk reaction to policy issues has kind of evens the field and makes some of those states more difficult to get things done. Next, we dug into the initiated process, either initiated constitutional amendments, initiated laws, or voter referendums. And we see when we look at these that Michigan electors have been asked to vote on an average of 2 citizen-initiated ballot questions per general election. The voter-initiated constitutional amendments have constituted the majority of these questions, followed by the voter-initiated statutory changes, and then the voter referendums. These have kind of gone in 2 stages. You kind of see 2 bumps here, 1968 through 1982, and then sort of 92 through the present. And in this context, the fact that we had 6 ballot questions in 2012 kind of stands out. Only going back to 1978 if we had as many initiated questions. Again, we looked at, well, first, let's put this in context. One of the things we see when we start looking at the initiatory process is that not every state allows for either initiated laws, initiated constitutional amendments, or for voter referendum. 24 states do not allow their citizens to petition for any of these. Another 14 states, those in blue, authorize all three, like Michigan, so you can do the constitutional amendment, the initiated statute, or the voter referendum. The 6 states in orange authorize initiated statutes and voter referendum, but their voters may not initiate a constitutional amendment. The 3 states in gray authorize constitutional amendments, but not initiated statutes or voter referendum. And the 2 states, Maryland and New Mexico, only allow their voters to use the voter referendum. They can't initiate laws or initiate constitutional amendments. So again, we tried to look at how the process in Michigan works compared to other states, again using Michigan as par, if you will. We see, first of all, looking at the initiated constitutional amendment, that most states make it a little more difficult to do this than is the case in Michigan. We see Oregon and Colorado have processes that are fairly easy compared to Michigan. There's California, Arizona, South Dakota, and Missouri have processes that are about equal, but then all of those states that are either pink or red have made it more difficult or have laws that are more restrictive in the process for getting proposals to the ballot. To do this, we looked at the threshold amount of signatures required on the ballot. We looked at whether the state uses direct initiative or indirect initiative. We looked at whether the state requires geographic diversity of the signatures, which would suggest a need for the circulators to go out and be more proactive in getting to all parts of each state to file the petitions. And we looked at whether they use county-wide or individual petitions, or whether those petitions could be submitted at the state level. So let's look at some of those details. For the initiated constitutional amendment, Michigan is like almost every other state in having a direct process. Once the petitions are filed, the question automatically qualifies for the ballot. Only Massachusetts and Mississippi have an indirect process, and the very limited number of constitutional amendments appearing in those states speaks to some of the difficulty created by having an indirect initiatory process. We also looked at the thresholds, and we benchmarked, or we, rather than just saying, it's 15% of the number of ballots cast for governor last election, or for Secretary of State, or a percent of the total population, we tried to normalize this. We looked at the number as a percent of the number of registered voters, which is the beige bar there, Michigan, the bright yellow, or as a percent of the voting age population, those being the brown bars are the more beige for Michigan. And you see there that Michigan ranks 11th among the states in requiring, it's about 6.3% of the registered voters, or about 4.5% of the total voting age population. Many of the states below us, Oregon, California, Colorado, require lesser percentages to qualify for the ballot, but we also see their states, Arkansas, Illinois, Massachusetts, that require lesser percents, but different provisions make it more difficult. So we can't judge it solely on the number of signatures as the threshold for qualifying for the ballot. We looked at the, again, the ability to initiate statute, went through the same process. And here we see that Michigan is about average. There's a fair number of green states or light green that show that it's easier in those states in a few states that are red or pink that shows that it's more difficult, about an equal number, which would suggest that Michigan's about average in this regard. So part of this process we looked at here is the maximum time period for circulating petitions. In Michigan, you have a 6-month window that can fall anytime within a 2-year period, that 2 years being defined by the general election, one to the next. That's a fairly short amount of time when we compare it to other states. Several of the states allow for as much as a year, year and a half, 2 years to get through this process. We looked at, let me back up here, we looked at the geographic diversity, and what we found there is that 9 of the 18 states that authorize constitutional amendments, and most of the states that authorize statutory initiative, have some provisions that require geographic diversity. This is done by either requiring that they collect a number of signatures in each geographic or each congressional district, or they use counties in some places that require some percentage of the counties be represented on the petitions. We also found that the use of county or statewide petitions varies from state to state. 12 of the states require signatures to be collected on county petitions, and those petitions then need to be submitted to the county clerk to be certified for the adequacy of the vote, or the adequacy of the number of signatures. The other 14 states, like Michigan, allow the petitions to be submitted to the state, and the certification is done at that level. We think this is significant because it influences how and where petition circulators can collect signatures. If you go back in history to prior to the mid-1970s, Michigan used city and township petitions, and each petition had to have the name of the city or the township represented, and only signatures from those petitions counted on counting those petition signatures. So if you think about the circulation process, each circulator would have to have petitions on hand for a potential signer to sign. There being 1,700, more than 1,700 units of government in Michigan, that would be a fairly large administrative burden. But even if you said they were going to collect it from a sub area of the state, if they went to a mall in Oakland County or around Ann Arbor, you would have only those jurisdictions that you could reasonably expect people to be going to that mall, but that still represents hundreds of potential jurisdictions where people could be coming from. Under the current process where a county petition is used, we see people collecting signatures at, for instance, the Clare rest stop on I-75, where people are coming from all over the state, and they're able to accommodate those signers in a fairly easy way. So it's really simplified or eased the petition collection process by going to the ability to submit on a statewide level and to deal with things in that way. So we again repeated the process looking at the voter referendum process in Michigan compared to other states, and we see that only a few states have less restrictions. Maryland, Washington, Oregon, fairly easy in those states to file for voter referendum compared to Michigan, but a large number of the states that are red or pink in those on this map indicate that it's more difficult to file for referendum in those states compared to Michigan. Again, we looked at the amount of time, and we find that Michigan's pretty average in having a 90-day window as a maximum time. We have 12 other states, Michigan included in that bar, that do it this way. And the other states are dispersed, either 2 states having shorter windows and several of the states having longer windows. Again, when we look at the initiative or the referendum, the provisions for geographic diversity hold true. The petition thresholds, Michigan tends to have the same relative ranking compared to other states, and they use the same petition collection process, either a county or a statewide process for submitting petitions. So all this boils down to some analysis. We don't make any recommendations in our report on whether Michigan should change its thresholds, but we do think it might be worth looking at. First of all, why are we getting all the constitutional amendments on the ballot and not as many statutory initiatives? We see that it's not that difficult to file a statutory initiative in Michigan compared to many of the other states. But we think what it really boils down to is that there's such a narrow difference in the thresholds that once somebody decides to go in the field to try to collect the petition signatures, they can get 8% to qualify as a statutory initiative, or for only 2% more qualify as a constitutional amendment. They're going to try to get more petition signatures than needed, so they have some buffer rooms knowing that some will be disqualified. And the idea of having greater permanency for the policy solutions that they're advocating seems to push people there. So our first thing, not a recommendation for change, but a recommendation to study it further, would be to look at the narrow difference in thresholds that have made it possible to qualify for constitutional amendments and as opposed to the statutory initiative. We also think it's worth looking at the thresholds in the context that it's a changing world. When we go back in history to when the initiative was first authorized a century ago and think about what's changed since then, we've developed the telecommunications, the electronic industry that allows us to give webinars like this, to advocate through email and television and radio, and the ability to communicate is advanced light years over what was the case then. We've developed the transportation networks so people and petition circulators can move freely throughout the state and get from one part of the state to the other in a matter of hours as opposed to days. So both of those would indicate maybe the times are changing and we ought to think about how we do things now and whether the provisions that were put in place a century ago really meet our needs for today. We also think it's worth looking at the issues of geographic diversity. This hasn't been a huge issue in Michigan, but there's been a few issues that have come up. The Michigan Civil Rights Initiative was clearly something that separated different geographies of our state, and there were some misgivings about whether the petition circulating process adequately represented all areas of the state. And we see this coming up with the ballot questions destined for the November 2014 ballot. We have questions on wolf hunting, and there seems to be some misgivings about whether the petition signers are coming from the lower peninsula and those geographies affected by the proposals are in the upper peninsula. In going through this whole thing, we want to think about who is affected, also with our length of period and whether those should be lengthened or shortened. I go back to what I said at the beginning, that this was really designed as a tool for direct democracy and a sort of grassroots effort to affect policy change. So if we think about policies to shorten the time period that would make it a little more restrictive to qualify for the ballot, that would seem to hurt the paid petition signers. It would require higher pay and maybe make it cost prohibitive to do things, but it would also hurt the grassroots efforts to the extent that those still play out, in the ability for people to get out and affect change on a voluntary basis. So let's look at some of the other issues. We looked at the laws affecting the petition circulators and how Michigan's laws relate to several of the other states. What we find is that states have made efforts to identify, restrict, or regulate paid petition signers with provisions that either require them to be registered voters in the state, require them to be of a minimum age, require the circulators to be differentiated from the paid from the differentiated from the volunteer circulators. And finally, there's some states that have attempted to restrict how proponents may compensate the paid circulators. Generally, when states have engaged in these efforts, they've done so to ensure that those engaging in this form of political speech have vested interest in the laws of the state, and that they help the citizen to know with whom they are dealing when they're approached to add signatures to circulated petitions. Some states have done it under the auspices of preventing fraudulent activity, and by putting these restrictions in place, they allow the states to identify and take actions against those that do engage in fraudulent activity. Those that oppose them have generally claimed that the restrictions infringe on their citizens' First Amendment rights to free speech and the ability to engage in political expression. These people say that the accounts of fraudulent activities are mostly anecdotal, and that the wholesale restrictions on free speech go too far in halting any bad behavior. So we went and looked at what each state does and how those states' provisions, first of all, require petition circulators to be residents of that state. We see that Michigan, most of the states require that the circulators be either residents of the state or registered voters. Of course, to be a registered voter, you have to first be a resident. In the case of Michigan and California, the law is written in a way that you have to be qualified to register to vote. So that would suggest you have to be a resident, you have to be at least 18 years of age, but it doesn't go so far as to say that you have to be registered. We see that there's a few states that have no residency requirements. Generally, the courts have ruled that the registration requirements reduces the number of petition circulators to carry the message to the plaintiffs and hinders their ability to engage in political discussion for the purposes of getting a measure on the ballot. As a result, there's fewer states going to that full registered voter, and more states, whether they've changed their laws or not, are going to the process like Michigan, that you have to be qualified to register the vote. We looked at the age petition. Again, Michigan says you have to be qualified to register the vote, so that would suggest you have to be 18 years of age at a minimum. Here the states have been a little more lenient. In the case of Buckley versus the American Constitutional Law Foundation, Justice Ginsburg said that age is commonly used as a proxy for maturity, and that maturity is reasonably related to a state's interest in preserving the integrity of the ballot issue questions. We see that many of the states impose an age restriction on petition circulators by requiring the circulators either to be registered voters or qualified to register, or they outright say that they must be 18 years of old or greater. Still, there are 11 states, there's 5 states, I'm sorry, 6 states, Washington, Oregon, Montana, Oklahoma, Florida, and Massachusetts, whose laws are silent on this, and therefore circulators can be of any age. A number of states have put in provisions to differentiate the paid circulators from the volunteer circulators. The actions generally taken that it's reasonable that people have the right to know whether the petition gatherers or volunteers working for a cause near and dear to their heart are being paid for the task of circulating petitions. Therefore, maybe not as their feelings not as strong. They feel that knowing that the petition gatherers are paid may cause people to hold these individuals to maybe a higher standard and report instances of fraud or people acting unprofessionally when they come across them in the field. Disclosure occurs in a number of ways. Some states require badges to be worn by the circulators, identifying them as paid or volunteer circulators. Some states have used different color paper, so the petition will appear in one color if it's being circulated by a volunteer, a different color if it's being circulated by a paid professional. Some states require written words on the page that is identifying the type of circulator. And also some states have used affidavits that must be filed with the state to indicate how signatures are being collected. Finally, we have the issue of those states that have limited, prohibited, or set restrictions on how circulators can be paid. The states that have done this believe that the propensity for fraud could be reduced if the circulators are not paid on a per signature basis. This has been litigated in a number of ways. Colorado was one of the first states to try to just completely ban the use of paid petition circulators, and it made it to the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Meyer versus Grant. And in the final result of that was that the court said that the Colorado statute violated the rights of these individuals by limiting the number of circulators able to voice the message of the appellees and the hours dedicated to spreading the message, which as a result limits the number of people that the message can reach. It also reduced the ability for the appellees to collect the number of necessary signatures, thus inhibiting their chances at making the measure a focus of statewide discussion. So what states have done either is prohibit the use of signatures, pay per signature, required that they be paid on a per hour basis, or in other ways limited how they can be paid so that there isn't so much pressure to get paid based on the aggressiveness of the circulator to bring in signatures. A few states require that the circulators attest that they've witnessed the signatures. Florida stands out as one of the states that doesn't. They've allowed circulation to occur through newspapers and the internet. Most states, like Michigan, requires that the circulator attests that they've witnessed the signature, and to their best of their knowledge, the person doing so is eligible to vote and willingly sign the petitions. So in the end, on the issue of petition circulators, we think there maybe is room for reform. However, we would tread very lightly for any policymakers that want to go down this road. The restriction and regulations should clearly be targeted toward a perceived policy problem, a perceived sense of wrongdoing that is going on in the field. If the Michigan reforms would hope to pass through the courts in surviving any First Amendment challenges that come before them. So those advocating that sort of change, I would advise to document what are the policy problems that are occurring and be able to clearly tie policy reforms to those perceived problems. Rather than blaming the petition circulators for our problems, we've really gleaned onto the fact that maybe the attention should be directed to having informed petition signers. A number of petitions have come through, and in the litigation process or in the process of weeding through the issues, people have said, well, we didn't quite understand what we were signing. And we really think that's the issue that we should be focusing on here. Instead of limiting who can serve as a petition circulator, we probably should be spending more time, more of our reform efforts at directing the information out so the registered voters understand the issues, understand what's on the petitions, and can sign those petitions based on more knowledge. The 2006 MCRI, the Michigan Civil Rights Initiative, was the most recent case of alleged misconduct, but even there it wasn't so much that the petition, people didn't understand what they were signing, and the allegations of misconduct were that the petition circulators were falsely encapsulating the arguments orally. So first of all, there needs to be a recognition in Michigan that the responsibilities of self-government require a higher level of understanding by the people. The people have reserved to themselves these tools of direct democracy, and in doing so, they bear some responsibility for understanding what they're doing. The courts, when they were talking about the Civil Rights Initiative, said it's a civic duty of voters in a direct democracy and the popular vote from the electoral process being the ultimate check on the petition process. So beyond just the citizens becoming more responsible and treating these petitions with greater deference, treating them more or less as a legal document and putting their name to it needs to mean something, we think there's actions that the state can take that would enhance the ability of citizens to understand what's before them. Our research found that other states have supplemented the civic duty by requiring prepared objective information such as pamphlets or pages on the state website be prepared so that people can take the time to find this information and be better prepared to deal with petitions when they're presented to them. These information can include ballot question summaries, fiscal notes, statements that are prepared by proponents and opponents explaining what a yes or no vote would mean. Really, it boils down then to the process that takes place. Once the ballot questions are approved for the ballot, 15 states require the Secretary of State or the Attorney General create this information either on pamphlets or websites, and that information be commonly available. Ballotpedia is a website that deals with the initiative and referendum and compares laws in different states. They've done a ranking of the tools that the states have made available and ranked the states, the light blue being excellent and scaling all the way down to those in purple being very poor. And you'll see that Michigan is one of the states in purple. The only thing that Michigan had going for it, it makes the proposals available on their website, but there's no prepared analysis done by the state. The state, in fact, links to the Citizens Research Council analyses of these questions. It's not done in different languages. It's not done in a number of ways that other states take the time to make that information available. There's no fiscal notes or issues of that matter. So what we found, are these other states able to prepare this information? What we found is that the petition certification process in every state except for Michigan, Illinois, requires the proponents to apply with the state to circulate petitions, and then there's a whole process that can go on before the proponents can actually go out in the field and start collecting signatures. In Michigan, the proponents of a ballot question can voluntarily go to the Board of State Canvassers to review the form and style of the petition, but there's no opportunity for review of the language or the substance of the proposals. And the proponents are not at all bound to heed the changes that are recommended, if any. It's certainly in their best interest, but they can take their chances and go to field without making any of those changes. Michigan does not require so let me jump ahead here, I'm sorry. One of the consequences of Michigan not having a front-loaded system, having what we've termed a back-loaded system, is that there's increased scrutiny being placed on the Secretary of State, on the Board of Education, on the Board of State Canvassers. We see it in the last election cycle with actions by the Attorney General and scrutiny of that person's actions, and then issues being taken to court. And because these issues are so politically charged, how the courts come down on these issues tends to taint our state courts with some political bias on how they might send these issues to the ballot or keep them off the ballot. What could be done then to front-load the system and move things forward? We find that the other states, the process typically include an application to circulate petitions. That application typically needs to be accompanied by some number of signatures or some monetary fees that would suggest that this is worthwhile pursuing, that people feel strongly enough about this that they're going to move forward. This would hope to weed through some of the, say, off-the-wall suggestions that come up from time to time. There's some process to weigh those proposals on the subject matter. Some states have restrictions on what can be done. There's a review of the substance of the proposals, the requirement to heed any recommendations on the substance. In some states is voluntary, in some states mandatory, but at least there's feedback at that point. And then there's, in some of the different states, either petition preparation, where the Secretary of State or the responsible party will either prepare the petition for the proponents or have a template available. So having gone through these other states, CRC is recommending in our paper that that we go to a front-loaded system, and that include the 100-word description be prepared before the petitions are circulated, and that 100-word description be included on the petitions. We think the Secretary of State should be involved in preparing voter guides, either in written form. I think a better solution would be electronic form on the state website. We would recommend that the Board of State Canvassers be involved in preparing the petitions, or in fact have a template available. We think there should be a step in the process for reviewing the substance of proposals, either through elected officials, the Attorney General or somebody of that stature, or through the court system. The Florida process is very interesting, where they take a pause partway through the process and allow the courts to consider any challenges. So you're not going through the whole process and spending hours and days and months collecting petition signatures only to find out that there was something wrong. We think there should be a step in the process where the Legislative Service Bureau is involved to make sure the language conforms with the drafting standards used in the legislative process, so that either constitutional amendments or initiated language is clearly in line with other laws that are made, and it's clear what is meant using those drafting standards to apply as it applies to other laws. Also, it would be beneficial if we would include a step in the process for preparation of fiscal notes, so that if a constitutional amendment or initiative is going to cost the state or cost local governments money, we can understand that when we're voting on the process. Once the questions are certified for the ballot, there's room for campaign and electioneering reform. We looked at the issue of whether the state can do anything to ensure that the campaigns are being truthful and that the electronic media being sent out is being truthful. And really, there's no role for government in doing that, is our conclusion and conclusion of many others. But again, if we could get this front-loaded, then there would be more information for people to assess what they're being told, and informed people can help them to sort through the issues. There is a role, though, for the state to look at the disclosure of funding and who's paying for the ballot campaigns. This has been an issue in Michigan lately, and it's certainly playing out in other states as elected officials are thinking about the regulation of issue ads. The laws generally say there's express advocacy, where people are urging you to vote for a candidate, and those that don't directly address the election of a candidate are termed issue ads. When we're talking about initiatives and referendums, by definition, we're talking about issue ads. As this issue is played out through the U.S. courts, they have made it very clear that unions, corporations, there's an ability to spend money on that, and there's little the state can do to regulate the spending of money on that. But the courts have made it very clear and in some way encourage the states to have disclosure so that people understand who is spending the money and how that money is playing out through the system. So we would recommend that Section 26 of the Michigan Campaign Finance Act be amended to add a subsection 7 that requires ballot question campaign committees report individual contributions that are used to pay for electioneering, communications, or independent expenditures made by the committees. We looked at vote requirements. There's a few states that require supermajority votes, either for adoption of constitutional amendments, or if there's issues where not everybody voting on the question weighs in on that ballot question, then there's need for supermajority votes. What we found when we looked at Michigan's history is that because most of our ballot questions have appeared at general elections, there's been high voter turnout, and that would suggest to us that there's really not need to think about any sort of change on this issue. So let me wrap it up. First of all, by saying I've alluded to a paper a couple of times here. We have a paper that is ready for publication, will be released probably Friday morning. We're tying up a few very loose ends, and it is ready to go out. So that will be distributed using our regular CRC channels, email distributed, as well as it'll be posted on the Citizens Research Council website. So watch for that if that's an issue that you want to follow up on. Let me recap some of our conclusions. First of all, we think that the use of the initiative has changed since its introduction a century ago. When the initiative and referendum was introduced, the perception at the time was that the legislature was being controlled by banks and moneyed interest, and this was a way for the people to have a voice in the system outside of that, the normal legislative process. But what we see now is that the moneyed interests are using the legislature, the initiative process to enact laws without going to the legislature, and we see great amounts of money being spent advocating for their policy solutions, bypassing the legislature and bypassing the give and take that occurs through that process. So I think it is worth looking at this issue and thinking about the threshold amounts of signatures and some of the restrictions that we put in place. We looked at the restrictions in Michigan and compared those to other states, and we found that Michigan is fairly average, more restrictive on some things and less restrictive on others, but on the whole, not unlike other states. Still, because of the narrow difference between the initiative and the constitutional amendments, we think it's worth looking at that issue. Also, because of changes in communication, transportation, and political engagement, it might be worth thinking about whether those thresholds are meeting our current day needs or whether they should be addressed. We're making no recommendations on changes in laws for petition circulators, but we do think that it would be very prudent to look at changing the way the certification process occurs to move it to a front-loaded system. And in doing so, we think this would clarify the roles for the Secretary of State, the Board of State Canvassers, the Attorney General. It would hopefully eliminate some of the political taint that might be happening with our courts and eliminate these 11th hour races to the courts to put things on the ballot or keep them off the ballot. And in the whole, we think this would improve voter confidence in the whole process. And again, we think there's room for more disclosure of funding in the ballot questions and would encourage reform of the Michigan Campaign Finance Act. So let me end there and see if we have any questions.
So if you do have any questions, please type them into your questions pane now, and I'm going to turn it back over to Eric in a second. But I just wanted to thank everybody for attending today and for bearing with us through our audio problems, both the delay at the beginning and some of our audio quality issues. If you are interested in this topic, as Eric noted, we'll be publishing a paper at the end of this week. We'll be putting the webinar up on the internet, at a minimum the slides, and if the technology permits, we'll put up the slide and the audio. And of course, if you have any questions on anything that you read or that you heard, feel free to contact us, and we'd be happy to help. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Eric to answer questions and to close out the webinar.
All right. We have a question about, wasn't the law regarding petition language changed requiring prior approval before circulating? The law requires that ballot proponents submit their petitions to the Board of State Canvassers prior to going to the field, but it doesn't require the Board of State Canvassers to validate those, to sign off on the form or style of the petitions. It only gives that information to the state so they have it on hand. This is good information that is one step in the right direction, but probably doesn't go far enough. Is there any specific legislation introduced? There's none at this point. Our paper has not been released yet, and we would hope once it is released that if there are policymakers in Lansing interested in this, that they would, we could work with them in moving this forward. Do you see any issue with the approval process of referendum petitions by the State Board Canvassers? I'm thinking of the holdup of Public Act 4 petitions regarding the font size. This is this question. It really gets to the root of why we think that this needs to be moved to a move the whole process to make it front-loaded. That if the petitions, if the proponents came to the state at the beginning of the process, the state, either by dealing with the font size, dealing with substance of the proposals, dealing with everything to do with the proposal, could be done at the beginning of the process. We would have more than just the Board of State Canvassers looking at it, and those rules could be sorted out legislatively. In the end, once the petitions are submitted, it would simply be the role of the Board of State Canvassers to look at the number of petitions submitted and compare that to the threshold amount. Does it meet that requirement or not? That's a simple ministerial role in judging the adequacy of the petition circulation. It doesn't require them to get into the details of did it meet this requirement or that, which is really beyond the purview of what we want them to do. Next question. Wondering if any states have something similar to Michigan, such as the voter-initiated petition that goes through the legislature rather than the ballot and bypasses the governor. Yes, our study looks at that. This is the issue of what we call direct versus indirect process. And bear with me just a moment. Yeah, so there are 6 states, including Michigan, that use the indirect voter-initiated process for statutes that requires the process, the proponents to submit the signatures. It then goes to the legislature. If the legislature fails to act, then it goes to a vote. Most of the states have a direct process where it goes directly to the vote. I would also note that Utah and Washington have, it's kind of a hybrid. It requires the proposals to be submitted prior to a legislative session. They, of course, have short sessions, unlike Michigan, where they meet throughout the complete year. And then there's the opportunity for the legislature to vote on, to act on that measure. If they choose not to, then it goes to a vote of the people. Can you explain what change you would make to Section 26.7 of the MCFA? The recommendations we're going to make, we're going to spell that out in detail in the report. The major change that we would make would be to require the campaign committees to, in greater detail, document where the money came from. At this point, they the IRS rules and the way the law is written doesn't require them to provide full detail, and we would like more detail on where the money has come from. There's a comment, the state should have little or no oversight of the ballot question. The 100-word description of the amendment is already required on the petition. You're right about one thing that changed. There's little access to the public due to the liability concerns of malls and post offices. So we're trying to be very careful here. We don't think the state should have a say in what the proposal is. It ultimately is up to the proponents to decide what they want their proposal to say. But if the process were moved forward, there would be an opportunity then to create that 100-word description and include it on the ballot so people could have some sense of what they are voting on. We've seen, even going back to a year ago, the November 2012, where some of the proposals took up more than a page of text to say this is exactly what's being proposed, and the average person on the street either doesn't or isn't willing to read through that whole thing and try to sort through what those issues are. So to create that 100-word description up front. Some states use state officials to look at the substance of the proposals and make recommendations on whether that could be improved or whether it should be changed to meet this or that requirement. Is it in violation of the U.S. Constitution? Other states don't include state officials in that way, but allow the opponents to make arguments saying, this is what we think is wrong with that, and those arguments for or against are presented in a written form. So I think that is all the questions that have submitted. I would be happy to respond to any other questions offline. My email, well, I can be reached through the CRC website. My email, elufer@crcmich.org. And thank you for your participation. You know, one final thing, would an official voter's guide be more properly handled by a nonpartisan nonprofit like the League of Women Voters? They, of course, do that now. They prepare voters' guides and try to get information out so people can be prepared. My hesitation there is that the League of Women Voters has gotten into endorsing some candidates or endorsing some proposals for the ballot, and I feel strongly that whatever is presented to the people to inform them shouldn't be steering their vote. So keeping it with the state, I think, would avoid that sort of issue. So let me sign off at this point. Thank you all for your attendance, and I look forward to hearing from you with any suggestions or comments you might have.